Well, good morning and welcome to Facebook Live once again, this time with Andy Wade and myself. And I am absolutely delighted to have Andy with me today. Andy, I have known Andy since before I was married. He and Tom were friends before we were married. And so our relationship goes back 30 years. And he has been a friend, a mentor in many ways, and an encourager. And so I am particularly inspired by his love for creation, which can be seen, of course, by the photo in the background there. And also by the work that he does with people at the margins. And I wish we had time to talk more about that today. But Andy, why don't you give us a bit of an introduction to yourself and tell us, a little bit more about your background that you would like us to know as well as we start this.
Wow, it's great to be here. It's fun to be here with you, Christine. I miss all our get-togethers when we were together at Mustard Seed Associates. It's been too long.
It has. It really has.
So, well, the mountain picture behind me, I took just on Monday when I was out riding with my brother on motorcycles out on Lolo Pass around Mount Hood, Wyeast, as the indigenous know it. And I grew up in this area, so I just fell in love with nature here in the gorge. I'm in Hood River, Oregon. And boy, I went up to school in Seattle at Seattle Pacific, and my wife and I were in Taiwan and back in Seattle, then over in Hong Kong for 16 years, and then moved back in 2008 to Hood River. And I've just been loving it, camping and gardening. Hong Kong was a wonderful time, but I couldn't get my fingers in the dirt. We lived in one of the most densely populated districts in the world in Kowloon City, and so it was hard for me because I need the soil and I need the earth, and I felt like I was in a concrete jungle a lot of the time.
I remember a friend of mine who used to host international students saying that some of them had never had their hands in the dirt in their lives. When they came, and boy, that was really sobering for me. And I agree with you, getting one's hands in the dirt, and I think it's part of the way that God has made us, and it's a little bit of what we're going to be talking about today as well, because one of the reasons that I wanted to have Andy being with us for this time of talking about hospitality is because years ago he did a post on the GodSpace blog about hospitality in the garden. And I was reflecting on that, read through it again. In fact, he did a couple of posts, one of them responding to the question, what if I gardened with God and neighbor in mind? Wonderful questions for all of us to ask. And so I was thinking this morning about the fact that, as we garden, this idea of hospitality for me this time around, because we've done a lot of other series on hospitality, but I've really been focusing on the whole thing of guest and host, that we are both guest in the world and we are hosts in the world. And I think nothing reflects that more than what we do in the garden, that we are called to be both hosts and guests, and particularly when we take this kind of approach that Andy had of thinking about the garden with God and neighbor in mind. And so I wanted you to talk a bit, Andy, about what you did in both your back and your front yard to invite God more intimately into your garden and to invite others more intimately into your garden as well.
Great, thanks, Christine. I want to back up a little bit because I've been reflecting on this, and I think it is kind of like the underlying understanding that shaped what I did. If you back up to the creation story, and the Creator puts humans in this beautiful garden. It's a lovely story of hospitality, but I was thinking also about how hospitality, especially I think in America, is more about control than true hospitality. I want to control the environment. I'm going to provide everything. And it's not that give and take that you were talking about, Christine. And yet in that story of creation, we have the lavish hospitality of the creator. And then the creator gives that to us to nurture and to care for. And it's that wild hospitality, that generous hospitality of God for us, toward us, and all of creation. And I just think that's a wonderful example. So like when I started gardening as a little kid, I wanted to garden, and I asked my mom for a garden, and she gave me a spot in the yard. And I did what you do in the late 60s, early 70s. I dug it up, I got rid of all the weeds. I used Casseron to kill the weeds around the edges, and I used tons of Miracle-Gro. And that's not hospitality, that's domination. And so fast forward to what, 2008, 2009, when we bought a house here in Hood River, and we had a pretty decent sized yard with it for a neighborhood. And we had this pasture grass that was just going wild in the back. It used to be an orchard when I was growing up. So it was really hard for me to buy a house in a place that used to be an orchard. But I started wondering, well, what would it mean to garden with God in mind? And then I started looking at, well, how did God design creation? And so I moved from having these straight rows and double dug rows. No, I was organic farming already, or gardening. And I started putting in curves because I noticed in creation, there are curves everywhere. And what I found was that as I wandered through the gardens, I couldn't go in straight lines anymore. I had to flow with the angles in the garden, and it slowed me down and it made me more contemplative. And so even as I did companion planting with lots of different flowers and vegetables working together, which is an image of hospitality in itself. Kind of like a potluck. I've decided that the best hospitality isn't when I put on a big lavish meal for a whole bunch of people, but it's when we have a potluck together and we're sharing hospitality. And that's sort of what the garden is.
That's what the garden does, yeah.
Yeah. So the companion planting, when you're allowing, to go freely and do, the marigolds to ward off some of the aphids. And I even use the radishes as, I love to eat the radishes, but I also use them as a bug trap near the carrots. So the carrots don't get eaten up by some of the bugs that are in the soil. So yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, but
I was so inspired by what you did. And we, I remember somebody drew out a design for our garden when we first were taking up some of the lawn, and they did straight paths. And Tom and I said, no, that doesn't work, even then, without thinking about it from this way. But it's so much more hospitable, inviting of people into the garden, and inviting that sense of the presence of God into the garden as well, which I think is just beautiful. And then, Andy, I know, again, I was inspired by what you did in the front yard as well, to invite neighbors into the space.
Yeah.
And do you want to tell us a little more about that?
Sure. So the backyard was like my sanctuary. Like I say, I love to get my hands in the dirt. It was a place I could go and be quiet with God and just enjoy creation and the bounty of creation, of God's abundance. But I started thinking about the front yard, and we had a big grassy patch next to the driveway in the front yard, and then shrubs along the sidewalk, a fence between the neighbors. And I thought, well, what if I garden with God and neighbor in mind? What would that look like? And so we got rid of all our tilling ideas, and we cut the grass really short in the front yard, put down cardboard, put down mulch and compost on top of that, and the grass was gone within 9 months. It was just beautiful, rich soil. So we had this empty canvas. Oh, and I ripped out all of the shrubs along the sidewalk. And what I started thinking about, and this goes again to the idea of scarcity or fear of scarcity, or do we live into the abundance of God? One of the reasons we have barriers is, this is my property. You can walk on the sidewalk, don't come onto my property. And part of that is our control, and part of that is a fear. If somebody comes onto our property, are we going to get sued if they get hurt? Or and I thought, well, let's get rid of that and trust God. And so we created curved paths that sort of, if you're looking down on it, looks almost like a star or an octopus. So there are two paths coming up
Let
from
me
the
just say,
sidewalk.
I will put it'll be after the session, I'll put a link to the post that Andy did, because it's got this beautiful photo of what he did. I don't think the photo I've got here, or maybe it shows. Yeah, there you are.
Yeah, that shows.
That's what Andy did.
Yeah. So there were two paths that come directly up from the sidewalk, and then one that goes to the door, one over, two other directions. The little half circle that was created right on the sidewalk, I turned into a community sun tea and herb garden. And it's really hard to get people to break down their own resistance, even neighbors, to coming into somebody else's yard and picking things. And we got a little traction, but it's really hard. I mean, these are big barriers that are cultural. They're really stuck in our heads. Put up a little free library, which I ended up having to take down and build one twice the size because it was being used so much.
Well, and you promised us the old one and we never got it.
I still have it. I'll get it to you. I'll get it to you. I'm so sorry.
Well, actually, somebody like three doors down, we now have a free library, which is lovely. So.
Oh, good, good. Well, next to the little free library, I put up a bench that just says, and I stole this from Christine, rest in the moment. I painted on the front of the bench. And it was under a tree. The tree is now gone from the neighbor's yard, but it was in a shady spot under the tree. So it's just a place of inviting neighbors to come in, to sit, to chat. We've had so many people and met so many people that have come up to the little free library or sat on the bench and been able to just get to know them. And it's been beautiful.
So, and what would you say? Would you say then that that's the most successful thing that you did in the garden, or what of the things you did do you felt was the most successful?
I think that putting in the little free library was probably the most attractive thing to the neighbors, and we've had young and old alike, and actually there's so many kids coming with their parents because we have a park at the end of our street, that half of the little free library that I built is a children's section. Lovely. Yeah. And I think that was probably the most successful as far as getting to know our neighbors. But hospitality also extends to creation, to all of creation. There is we put a bird bath in the center, but it has rocks in it, lots of rocks that poke out of the water. And a lot of people don't know this, but if you just have a bird bath, the bees will try to come and drink out of it, and other insects, and they'll fall in and drown. So you need to have sort of jagged rocks that go jut out of the water so they can get in and out to drink easily.
Yeah.
And of course, no pesticides in the yard. So trying to really be bee and butterfly and critter friendly. The other part of that is putting big rocks in the garden, not just soil, but putting rocks and driftwood, other things like that, because those intersections between the dirt and something like a rock or a piece of wood create a safe space for bugs and bees to live. So it's how do we be hospitable toward creation?
One of the things I've really been enjoying lately is the British show Gardener's World. And one of the things that they talk about a lot is creating bug hotels, and hospitality for bugs. And it was a kind of a new concept for me. I mean, I knew you should, but I love that nomenclature because it makes you think of hospitality if you think of creating a bug hotel. And then recently, reading the post that Louise Connor did, firstly for Circlewood and then on GodSpace, about the safe corridors, safe passages for not just for animals. You know, I think I've been aware for many years that there are places where people are creating safe corridors for animals to be able to get across freeways and, you know, kind of travel from place to place without getting killed. But people are starting to do similar things for pollinators as well. You know, so there are safe passages that go through cities and everything that are hospitable places for them to come and to replenish themselves in their journeys, and, you know, just to find a home as well.
Yeah.
And I think that's a beautiful kind of concept too. So, you know,
It is. And one of the other things that I've seen people do is getting neighborhoods together, or even cities, and creating the green passageways, tree passageways for birds.
Yes.
Because they also need that, especially as the climate's warming. It helps with climate change, but it also helps the birds and other flying animals find safety.
Yes. Oh yeah, yeah, it's so important. And, you know, this is where I was just saying earlier that I think kind of the trend that the posts on GodSpace have been taking in terms of speaking about hospitality this time round, because we've done other series on hospitality, the emphasis on guest and host has really highlighted these things for me, and the importance of us. And what if, instead of thinking about ourselves as, you know, having dominion over creation or even being stewards of creation, what if we think about ourselves as guests of creation? You know, because we really are. We're guests of creation. We're, you know, both Andy and I are gardeners. You know, we get a lot of produce out of the garden. And I think that is, this year, I've thought a lot about how I am, you know, the garden is I'm a guest to the garden, you know, and the beauty of it, all the senses that are stirred as I see myself as a guest of the garden. And I think of, you know, some of what you do, Andy, in terms of both gardening and your foraging too, where you must be very aware of being a guest.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Do you want to tell us a little about the foraging? I'm envious. This is an aspect of Andy I'm envious of. So.
Well, I blame my oldest brother, Vernon. He got me into hunting mushrooms, and that's why I'm wearing the shirt today. He has taught me a lot about foraging, about identifying mushrooms, and we go out all the time. In fact, I was looking for boletes on the mountain just on Monday. I didn't find anything, but they can be out there, and we're getting ready for the fall with chanterelles and lobster mushrooms and boletes and matsutake and all sorts of wild mushrooms. And what's interesting, it's you go out and you look and you see certain mushrooms that the animals are also foraging on, and that just reminds me of, you know, this is for everyone. This is an abundance of creation for creation. Mm-hmm. And I'll admit that my tendency is, like, I run into a bunch of chanterelles and I got to take them all. I've got to take them all. And, you know, the indigenous way is to take what you need. Mm-hmm. And leave the rest. And I'm trying to learn that. It's really hard though, because I love chanterelles. And when you see a whole bunch of them, you want to, you know, take them all. And for those that are concerned about over harvesting, understand that mushrooms are the fruit of the tree. So the tree is underground, the mycelium. And just like picking apples or cherries, you're not going to ruin the tree by picking all the fruit. Mm-hmm. There are things that you can do that will ruin it. But so, yeah, just learning to share our abundance. Mm-hmm. And I was thinking about that this morning as I was sitting outside under the trees. And this thought came to me, if you want to truly live freely, then you need to live freely toward your neighbors and all creation.
Mm.
That you cannot be free and be selfish.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
You
Yeah.
cannot be free and not be hospitable.
Yeah. I would agree wholeheartedly. And I think this kind of hospitality is at the core of the gospel, really, you know. I mean, it was interesting to me in the 2008 recession, how people that got themselves into the garden learned generosity in a way that made them feel as though they had an abundance rather than scarcity. And I think that gardening, getting into the garden and recognizing, you know, the hospitality of the garden in a way, in providing for us, can totally change our attitude.
Yeah.
You know, and I'm sure that the foraging has a tendency to do the same thing for us.
It does.
Well. Yeah.
In fact, during the because of the COVID epidemic, a lot of people started foraging. And so some of our favorite spots were just, we'd go there and they'd be all picked out. And worse yet, and I think this is true for gardening, and why what you do, Christine, and others in the garden and in other places is so important, is that how we approach the abundant generosity of God, the hospitality of God, is extremely important.
Yeah.
And you know, we go out to the mountains and we see trash everywhere. We see toilet paper everywhere. I've decided that there needs to be a license to go into the woods. and the one required course is how to poop in the woods. And I'm only half joking.
Yeah, no, I know what you mean. It's like dog poop everywhere.
Yeah.
Human poop everywhere is even worse.
Yeah. But I mean, you can take up gardening and dump tons of chemicals in your garden because it looks like it's effective and you don't realize what it's doing to yourself and what it's doing to creation.
Yeah.
So I think that there is the good part of people getting into the woods or getting into the garden, but there's also this part of learning to walk with creation rather than to dominate it.
Mm-hmm. Well, don't you think that part of it is that we have developed such a utilitarian viewpoint towards creation, and this is really what you're talking about, is what shows it exactly, you know, that we don't see it as something that matters. You know, I mean, we don't see ourselves as a guest in the midst of that creation. And I think if we did see ourselves as a guest, you know, if we go to visit somebody, hopefully we don't trash their house, you know, you know, we welcome their hospitality, but we have certain constraints on our own behavior that say we're going to leave this place in the same kind of condition, as it were, that we came into it, you know. And I think that we need to have that same kind of hospitable attitude towards creation and towards our gardens, as you say.
Yeah.
Another
and I think
another aspect of the hospitality is this whole thing of pesticides. You know, it's not just what we do in the garden, it's a matter of what we don't do in the garden that matters too. Sorry, you were going to say something, Andy.
Oh, I was interrupting you. I was thinking about in the Hebrew scriptures, there are laws that God gives, and we don't like, you know, to hear about laws that God gives, but you know, they're kind of like laws of nature. So when the farmers would have crops, they were commanded to not harvest right up to the edges of their property, but to leave that, and they left it for the animals and for the poor to be able to glean to the edges. And there's you know, there is a movement in the US where you have a garden, and for every 10 rows or whatever, however you do it, plant a row for the poor and give it to the food bank.
Yeah.
Or plant a fruit tree or vegetables in your front yard and invite the neighbors to come and harvest.
Yeah. Yeah, that's part of what we do. You know, we always like last year we had a huge crop of apples.
Yes.
It's a wonderful chance to be hospitable. In fact, it was interesting because we asked somebody from one of the local churches if they'd like to come and bring some other people. And this church was near the university. And they actually, what we didn't know is they went out on campus and just asked some random people.
They thought you had an orchard?
Well, and actually there were these 3 Japanese girls that came, young women. They'd never picked apples before. They'd just arrived in the country.
Oh, wow.
And they came and they picked apples. And then, of course, you know, I can't have people just pick apples. We did morning tea. We had tea and chocolate zucchini bread. They had an absolute ball.
That's beautiful.
Never heard from them since, but to be hospitable to strangers. And they were, you know, I thought there were people that the people that we'd asked knew, but they weren't. They were strangers. And it was a delight to be able to provide, you know, apples for them and for the others that came as well in this way. Hospitality, yeah.
And you haven't even mentioned the almond tree that you planted for the squirrels.
Exactly, yes. And the sunflower, somebody today, one of my big sunflowers is about to flower. And they said, do you pick the sunflowers? I said, no, the squirrels always beat us to it, you know. But providing for the creatures, I think is, you know, that's one of the things that I've realized is necessary when we garden. And if we have that attitude of hospitality, of generous hospitality, not just to people, but to all of the creatures that inhabit our garden, then it really does change our kind of frustration at things that disappear. To, you know, kind of let's welcome them, you know. Now my Swiss chard, which always looks very lacy unless I have a cover over it, because the chickadees love Swiss chard, absolutely love it. So and that one I am not willing to let them have my Swiss chard, so I do keep it covered.
Well, I will admit that I celebrated St. Bridget's feast the other day. I would like a lake of the finest ale for the King of Kings, so I put some cheap ale out in the garden for the slugs because they've been devastating some of them.
I'm not sure that counts as hospitality somehow.
Okay. Well, on a real hospitality note for creation, one of the things that I've changed in my gardening is, you know, in the fall, we're supposed to go clean up our gardens, right? I don't clean up my gardens anymore. If there are bad things out there that I need to get rid of, then I do take those out, but I leave like all the sunflower stalks. And I leave a lot of the things and let them go to seed. We've got a lot of amaranth and I let that go to seed because the birds and the bees and the beetles, you know, it's their homes and it's their food and it helps them survive the winters.
Isn't it wonderful not to have to deadhead everything at the end of the season?
It is, but it does make more work in the spring.
Yeah.
You know?
But it is important. Yeah, I think it's another aspect of hospitality in the garden that we need to remember, is that being hospitable is leaving things that our culture says, our uptight culture says, oh, you've got to deadhead everything.
Yeah, got to have bare soil in the fall.
Yes, and have bare soil. And that's actually part of what I've loved about this show, Gardener's World, because they talk a lot about making sure that you leave things, you know, for the animals and for the microbes even, you know, not disturbing the microbes. I mean, I know when we first did gardening, it was the double dig method and you went down 2 feet, you know, and we did it. Boy, was it a job. And now, of course, you just cover it with cardboard and you don't disturb it, which is, and I think that it's interesting because to me, it seemed as though that early time of gardening, we were kind of learning from industrial gardening, you know, and the constant tilling of the soil. And now we're learning from nature itself, but I think also more from Indigenous people who have always had this very hospitable relationship with the land and with their gardening. And we, of course, have so much to learn from them in this regard.
Yeah, yes. And it's, yeah, just getting out in the garden, getting out in the woods, getting out into nature and realizing, and I think this is the core of hospitality, is it moves us from me to us, that really everything about us. And I spoke on this in church a couple of months ago. I was reading about my body, and in somebody my size, 5 to 7 pounds of me is not me, but it's microbes and all sorts of things that are living in me. And if I wasn't a community, I couldn't exist.
Mm-hmm.
So even when I say I or me, I can't really do that without dying. And I think that's a beautiful place to start personally, is that there is whether I like it or not, there is a kind of hospitality, there's a hosting going on in my body itself. And that's a picture of what we are to be in the world.
Mm-hmm. Yep, it is. It's lovely. It's a lovely analogy. And in our gardens, kind of, we're learning more and more, of course, about the importance of the microbes and, the fascinating stuff about the fungal filaments and, kind of that interrelatedness, the hospitality, the mutual hospitality that goes on and that is so important, I think.
Right.
Unfortunately, Andrew, we've run out of time.
Oh, that was too fast.
I know. It's just kind of stirred the top of the pot as far as I'm concerned. And one of the things that I was saying to Andy, I've been thinking, of course, about writing another book, and I've been thinking about writing it on rhythms and seasons. But as we've gone through this season in God Space of talking about hospitality and this kind of host guest kind of relationship, I'm thinking, wow, I think I'd like to do some more writing on this. Certainly some more research on this. I know John Philip Newell and Matthew Fox talk about this kind of hospitality and guest mentality. And I know some of the Native American people talk about this kind of a relationship as well. And I think that we've got so much more to learn in this way, that it's something that really inspires me. And I think it inspires Andy too. Any last words for us, Andy, as we close off here?
Well, your last comment made me want to pitch a book from a dear friend of both of ours, Randy Woodley. And that is the book Shalom and the Community of Creation.
Wonderful book. Yeah.
It's an amazing book. And if you want to learn a bit more about the idea of shalom, which I think is really hospitality. I mean, it's all woven together, but looking at it from an Indigenous perspective, and the community of creation. I just love that.
Yes, I love it too. It's a wonderful book. Yeah. Well, and Andy, and in fact, it's interesting you saying that, because I was just thinking as we were talking, I should get Randy to do one of these Facebook Live sessions with me.
You should get Randy and Edith together.
That would be wonderful.
Yeah, they're amazing.
Oh, I'd love to get down there again. They have this wonderful property down in Oregon where they're doing, using Native American kind of techniques for farming and such. And I'd like to get down there and learn more from them again.
Yeah, it's a beautiful space they have.
Yeah, every time you go there, Andy, I'm envious. So. Anyway, thank you so much for being a part of this.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, you're welcome. Lily Lewin will be back again with us. And then I might see if we can get Randy Woodley to do something. He's doing so much creative stuff. And I'd love to see if, and as you said, Randy and Edith. But and of course, before I close, I should give a pitch for our God Space community cookbook that we're putting together, which I'm still hoping that Andy is going to give me some recipes for. I think, he talked about the tea herbs and things for the teas. And I thought, what about some recipes for teas, Andy? Or from those mushrooms?
Well, I could send you a recipe for crab stuffed morels. The
That
morel
sounds-
season is over now, but next spring.
That sounds delicious. And for, just they don't have to be exotic things, but things that you do, and things you've learned in the garden. I mean, and for others too, we'd love for more people. This is kind of a hospitality sharing cookbook is part of what we're trying to put together. So I hope that you might consider being a part of it too. We've got people from Norway, I think from Switzerland, from Puerto Rico, from hopefully Fiji, New Zealand, Australia, US, and Canada that I know of that are probably contributing. So, if you
great.
would like to contribute, we would love to have your contributions as well to this. And thank you for taking this time to be with us.
Yes, thank
Blessings,
you all.
Andy.
It's good to be with you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.